Hello, I'm Robbie Carlton. Welcome back to Learn React in about 4 videos. This is video number 2. If you have not watched video number 1 yet, you should go back and watch video number 1. Video number 1 was an introduction to React, getting you set up, and then talking about components. So it's very important, really necessary before you can do this video. Okay, I'm assuming you've watched that, so welcome to video 2. Brief recap. In video 1, we talked about components. There you go. And we created the components for our app. So let's take a look at that right now. So here is our app. All the components are in place and they don't do anything yet. So in today's video, we are going to be talking about state. And at a very high level, state is the thing that without state, I'll start like this. Without state, all your components can do is organize HTML into kind of useful little, encapsulated, self-contained little things, which is, that's cool. That's pretty good. It promotes reusability, so you can make a column component and you can use it multiple times. So it's better than just having HTML to have your React components, stateless React components. Better than just HTML, you can reduce your code size and organize your code in convenient and useful ways. But the end user experience is still going to be a static web page. This is a static web page. It's presenting information, but it's not in any way interactive. So to make your page go from being static content to being a user interface, to being an interactive piece of software, that's where state comes in. So it's really useful and it's really cool, and we're going to get into it. So what is state? State is data which is stored in your component and can change over time. And so anytime that a component needs to remember something, that's where you use state. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a very simple example before we move on to adding state to this app. We're going to create a new component that's very simple to demonstrate the idea of state. And this component is going to be a counter. So what it's going to do, there's going to be a display which shows you the number that you've counted to. There's going to be a plus button, and there's going to be a reset button. So when you hit the plus button, the number in the display goes higher. When you hit the reset button, the number in the display goes to 0. And that's the whole component. And just take a brief moment to think about how you would do that using the React code we already know. And I'm not even going to ask you to pause the video, and I'm not going to leave you hanging for any longer, because the answer is you can't. That's why we're introducing state. So let's go and add some code. So just in the interest of convenience, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to comment out this and just add our new component. Well, let me create the component first. So this is, making a mess of our code, but I'm going to clean it up later, so don't worry. Oops, that's a hangover from an old way of doing things. So we want a number, and we want a plus button. I'm going to say increment so that the button is bigger and it's easier to press, and reset. Okay, and then we're just going to render this in our app, just for the convenience of having it already set up. So here is our number, and here's our increment button and our reset button. Right now, I click and it doesn't do anything. So this is the important part. We're going to add state to this component so that it works, so that it does what we want it to do. So how we do state, and this is one of those differences. If you remember in the previous video, I talked about class components. So class components do state a little differently. We're not going to talk about that. There's plenty of resources out there if you want to learn about class components. For functional components, this is how you do state, and it's a thing called a hook. Oops, that's not how you do that. This is how you do that. It's a thing called a hook. And I'm going to do a little aside about hooks. So a hook is a special kind of function that in React, and it's special because React treats it differently. And there are a few primitive hooks. useState is one of the primitive hooks, and there are a couple others. We're going to talk about another one in a later video called useEffect. Those are the two most commonly used hooks. There's another couple of people use. But these primitive hooks, you can then build your own custom hooks out of primitive hooks. So a hook is any function which is one of the primitive hooks, or a function built out of primitive hooks which obeys certain rules. And I will explain those rules very briefly. But one thing to note about hooks is they all begin with the word use. So you don't have to understand hooks in great detail right now. The main thing to know about hooks is whenever you call a hook, which is a function, you have to call it at the top level of your component function, and it can't be conditional on anything. So you can't say, if such and such condition, then call a hook. So basically, every hook in your rendering function, in your component, which is this, every hook has to be called every time this function is run. And the simplest way to understand that, and exactly once. So you can't put it in a loop, and you can't put it in a conditional statement. It has to just be at the top level. And you can only call a hook from this function. I think I already said that. Okay, so that is pretty abstract, and that's hooks. useState is a hook. So all of those rules apply to useState. You got to call it in your rendering function, nowhere else, or in a custom hook. Excuse me, in rendering function or custom hook. We're not going to do custom hooks in this video series. And you have to make it not conditional. It has to always be called. So you couldn't do if, some condition, then useState, call useState in any way. Not allowed to do that. React will just complain. So instead, this is what it looks like. So to use the useState hook, this is how we do it. Oh, we're not going to put it in app. Sorry, we're going to put it in counter. And so just pause for a second. I'm going to pause for a second. Think about what is the state that we need for this component to remember over time, right? We said state is data that may change over time that the component stores within itself, but it remembers. It's like, what does the component need to remember to do its job? Just think about that for a moment. You can pause the video. Okay, it needs to remember one thing, which is the count. So we're going to create one piece of state, and it's going to be called count. So here's how you create state using the useState hook. Okay, so I'm just going to go over this. So const just means we're defining these as constants, so they're not going to change. It's a little confusing because I just said it will change over time, but it's not going to change within one iteration of this function. Each time this function gets run, count will be the same value for the whole length of the function, even though the next time the function is run, count might change. And we haven't got into this yet. We're going to go into it in more detail when we talk about useEffect later on. But just so you know, every time either the props or the state change, the function re-renders, the component, re-renders, which means this function gets run again and the new output gets put out. So we're going to see this in a second, actually. So they're const just because they're not going to change within one run of the function. That might be a little counterintuitive or confusing. Don't worry about it. It works. And so the next thing to see is this array destructuring syntax. So what this means is that this function returns an array, and we're going to take the first two elements of that array and assign them to variables called count and setCount. And the fact that that works is just the nature of useState. useState returns these two different objects in an array in the first and second element of the array. And we just know that it does that, and so this is always how you use state. What will change is you can call these variables anything you want, right? So you can call them number and adjust number. That would be fine. Nothing would change about the functionality, right? Those are just variables. You could call them, foo and bar, and it wouldn't matter. It would just make your code harder to read. There is a convention that you call it the variable name that you care about, the name of the piece of state, and then set that thing. And that's just a convention. You should follow it because it's going to make your code easier to read for you and for anyone else that's reading your code. So then the last part, use state. So we're calling the use state function, and it's returning these two different things. And we're calling it with a parameter. Now, what is this parameter? This parameter is the default value of the state. So this is saying the first time we run the function, when we initially create the state, we want it to be 0, which makes sense. We're creating a counter, so we want the counter to start with a count of 0. And so then what do these two things do? Well, hopefully they're pretty self-explanatory. The naming helps you to understand them. Count is the piece of state, so it's the number, and setCount is a function which you call to set the count. Okay, so I'm going to show this in use. So we replace our static data here with our count state, and then increment and reset. So we're going to say on click, oops, and we're going to pass it a function. We're just going to call this increment. So we need to define this increment function. When I'm defining a function inside of a function, unless there's a very good reason not to, I like using this fat arrow syntax. It just clutters the code up much less. And so increment is a function. It gets called on click. Oh, and this is, so this is in React, if you want a function to be called when you click a button, or any element actually, you just pass the on-click attribute, whatever the function is that you want. So that's, I just glossed over that, but that's a really important piece of how you get interactivity. There are some other, there are some other event handlers that you could do, but on-click is a very common one. And that's the one we're going to be using right now. And in fact, I think it's the only one we use in this whole app. So this is just a function which will get called when this button gets clicked. So it doesn't take any arguments. Oops. And here's what it does. It calls setCount with the current count plus 1. So this just says when we call increment, call setCount, passing it the current count incremented by 1. That's pretty self-explanatory, hopefully. So let's go and see it in action. So we see now our default value is being picked up, and our count, we're at 0. And then when we click this, ta-da, I'm clicking it, and it's incrementing. Now, setting reset, I would almost leave this as an exercise to the reader, but I'm not going to, just because this is a brand new concept, so it's helpful to get a couple of reps of somebody showing you. So what we're going to do is create a new function called reset to fire the reset button. And I just want to point out that the names of these functions are totally arbitrary. Right? This could be called foo, and it would work the same. This could be called bar, and it would work the same. Again, the naming of function names and variables is for human readability. It is not, the computer doesn't care, for the most part. There are little exceptions to that, but for the most part. So one exception is you want to call your hooks use, because actually that signals things to React and to plugins that you might have in your code editor to warn you about whether you're using a hook correctly. So this is a case where actually the variable name does make a difference, and you couldn't just call it anything you wanted. But for the most part, that's not the case. You can call things anything you want. And so the thing that decides what you should call things is what makes your code the easiest to read with the least surprises and the least confusing gotchas. And that is something you learn over a long time. And it is famously one of the hardest things in all of software engineering. But right now, I think these are pretty easy. So increment and reset. One little tip: functions should be verbs, and variables should be nouns. Except component functions, which are nouns. But nonetheless, so now we have a reset. But this reset, right? Spot the deliberate mistake. The reset button is just doing the same thing as the increment button because I didn't change the code. So what should this say? Think about it for a second. What's the reset button supposed to say? And just as this, right? Set count to 0. So now increment, 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 reset. Ta-da! Increment, 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 reset. Okay, so that is that's the demonstration of state. Now, okay. How about this? We're gonna get a little complicated now, but I hope this is gonna be helpful. So, what if, for some reason, because of our application, we wanted to count the number of times that we'd hit the reset button? That we had another number, which was our reset count. So, in order to do that, what would we do? Pause the video for a second, think about it. Okay, you back? Did you really pause it and think about it? It's good to pause it and think about it. See, now you actually know everything you need to know to implement this functionality. So if you didn't pause it now, think about it. Okay, I'm going to show you. So what we would do is create another piece of state in exactly the same way that we created the first piece. Okay, but we need to change this a little bit because right now it's complaining and it won't run because, or I'm not sure what it'll throw a runtime error. But anyway, it won't be happy because because we're using the same variable name twice and it's a constant, so you're not supposed to do that. So we need a new variable name, which is good anyway because it makes otherwise we couldn't distinguish between the two things. So now we're going to call this piece of set the reset count. Now, remember what I said about nouns and verbs and how naming things is the hardest thing in programming. So reset count is both a noun and a verb, right? You can hear it either way. But this is the count of the number of resets. So we're hearing it as a noun. This is subtle stuff, but it starts to get important. And then set reset count. Okay, and it helps, the context helps. It's a piece of state, so we know that we should read it as a noun. We want to initialize this at 0 as well. Initially, there have been no resets. And then we need to just implement this. So first of all, we need to display it. So let's say count and then reset count. Now let's look at this. Okay, so now we have count and reset count. We increment, increment, increment. We reset. Oh man, the reset count is not yet implemented, so it doesn't work. We've reset 4 or 5 times at this point, and it's not going up. So it's pretty simple. We just need to extend the definition of the reset function so that as well as setting count to 0, it also sets reset count to reset count plus 1. Make sense? Let's see if it goes now. Bam! Reset count went up. Reset. Look at that. So that's the reason I'm showing you this, which is not a particularly useful piece of functionality necessarily, but the reason I'm showing it to you is because in your components you will often need multiple pieces of state. And so this is how you do that. I want to point out something else as well. These two pieces of state are both integers, but they can be anything. It can be any JavaScript object. It can be a string. It can be some kind of an array. It can be an integer. It can be a float. It can be a compound object. So anything you want. It can be a function. Anything you want, you can store inside a state. Okay. Now let's go back to, let's get rid of this. Goodbye counter, thank you for your help. And I'm gonna uncomment this code and go back to this. So there are a couple of pieces of state that we are interested in. And the one we're gonna look at today because it doesn't involve forms. And we haven't covered forms yet. We're going to cover forms next. First, we're doing state. So the one we're going to look at today is adding a card. So we're going to add a card. And actually, this does include a form, but we're going to cheat, and we're just going to use the JavaScript, the window.prompt. So that's just where you prompt for input from the user using the window. It means we don't need to learn about forms yet. Okay. So the main thing that we need to do is to save the cards in the column. So we need state where the column remembers what cards are in it, and we're gonna do that. And so we're gonna put state at the level of the column. And we're going to put it down here. Now, it's okay for it to be down here because there's nothing conditional happening above. And we're going to say cards and set cards equals. And then here, we're going to use this special feature of the object destructuring syntax where we can rename this, and we're going to say initial cards. So when this component first initializes, it's going to read the cards from the component and set them as the initial state for the card's state. But from then on, the component is going to use the card's state, its own internal state, rather than the state that's coming from the column, which is coming from a prop. So we're mapping over the cards like this. So we need to, let's do this. Let's do it this way. So I'm going to leave that here for a second, and we're going to change add card form. So add card form. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a function on, we'll just call it on click. So what happens on click? Const text equals window.prompt. Enter your card text, and then I'm just going to do a console.log the card text, and there's the text, and then we are going to pass this on click function. I should really call this handle click. Okay, so we've added a little bit. We're not all the way there yet, but we've added a little bit of functionality to add card form. So now I'm just going to open up the console. Oh, I forgot about this. I remembered this after the last video, and then I was going to do it at the beginning of this video, and I forgot. Because we have the console open, I'm going to do it now. Sorry, this is we're jumping around a little bit, but that's hopefully not going to be too confusing. So forget everything that we've just done for a moment, and React is complaining. What is this complaint? Each child in a list should have a unique key prop. And it says it twice, and then it kind of points to different places. React error messages generally very helpful, and so it's pointing to a couple of different places. And I know where they are because I just know exactly what it's complaining about. What it's complaining about is every time you map over an array, you need to give each element, each thing that you're rendering in the map, you need to give it a unique key. And you can do this just by saying key equals and putting something in here which is going to be different for each iteration. So with the columns have an ID, and each ID is different. So we can just say column.id. And the reason for this is React needed to do some bookkeeping. I'm not going to go into more detail on that, but you don't really need to think too much about it 90% of the time, 95% of the time. You just put the ID of the thing you're mapping over or anything that's unique. You can even, at a pinch, there is a second parameter passed to, or a second argument passed to the function that you pass to map, which is an index, and that just increments 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. So you can even do that, and it will stop React from complaining. Occasionally that might get you into trouble, but normally you just want to do this. So you just get some ID, something that's unique. If you're mapping over strings, you just use the string itself, as long as you know that it's going to be unique. If it's not unique, then weird things can happen. So that's when you might use that index. So now if I save this, now we only have one complaint. See that? Because we map over cards. So cards also have an ID, so we're just going to do the same thing. Key equals card.id, and then save that. And we're good. Now it's complaining about something else. So now, sorry about that, brief digression, but really important. If you see the errors like that, it's complaining about how each child needs a unique key. That just means you need to do this. Okay, back to add card form. So we've implemented this handle click. So when we click on the add card form, it's going to show a window prompt us for some text. We put in the text, and then it's going to log it. Okay, so let's see that. Enter your card text. Hi there. Okay, card text. Hi there. Great. But what we want to do is we want to create a new card when we do that. So how do we do that? Well, add card form doesn't know anything about the state of the column, which is where we're going to be adding the card. So it needs to be passed a function for adding the card. So we're just going to, as a prop. So we're just going to say that it has an add card prop. And so what it does is, and I'm just going to make this conditional because if you cancel, then so if you cancel the prompt, it shouldn't add a card. So we say if text, then add card text. Pass the text into the add card function, which we haven't defined yet. So let's go define that. So we define that in column, and I'm just going to say add card. So it's a function which takes text as its only argument, and then it's going to call set cards, and okay. So it's going to say set cards, and we need to pass set cards a card object. So what does a card object look like? It's an ID and some text. So we're going to say ID, and right now we're going to cheat. We'll come back to that, and then text. So this is just shorthand for saying that. If your variable name is the same as your key name, you don't need to type it twice. Okay, so now we need to pass add card as a prop into add card form, and let's add a card in here. New card. So I made a mistake. This happens. And I understand what the mistake was, but I'll show you. So see if you can think about, so here's the error. This was obviously intentional for you to have a learning moment. See if you can think about what is the mistake. Cards.map is not a function. Let's look at the code. And pause it if you like. I'm now going to fix the error. So what I did is when we added a card, I set cards to be one card object, but actually cards should be an array of card objects. And so instead, what I need to do is say set cards dot.concat, and then an array of one element, which is our new card. So let's try that again. Does it work this time? Okay, there you go. So We added a new card. How about that? Awesome. Aha! We got a new error. So remember I said I was cheating about something? Think about why we got that error. Now that error was intentional. I knew that was coming. And here. Don't get an error here. But if we add it again, now we do. That was harder to see, but this number incremented by 1 to say we got the same error. So that is because we have multiple. I mean, it says it counted 2 children with the same key, 999. So we had multiple cards with the same key. So we need to find a way to have a unique ID for each card as we're adding it. Now, there are a few different ways of doing this. I am going to grab something from the finished code, which has this. Okay, so we've made a new function, get new card ID, which we call. And basically what this says is find the highest ID among cards that we already have and then increment it by 1. So we know we're always going to be getting a new number that's higher. That's a nice property of the integers, is you can do that. So now we have a functionality, we have a feature. So there is our ability to add cards. A new card in the ready column. Now, I imagine you're immediately thinking about the next piece of functionality, which is, I mean, there are a few different things left. So let's look at that. There is implementing this as a form, which we're going to do in the next video. And then there is implementing this functionality, moving cards back and forth, which we're going to do in the video after that. So next is the form and forms. That should be a short one. And then there's going to be another video on state, just talking about more kind of architectural decisions about state and this idea of lifting state up. Okay, now, but that is almost it for this video. I want to give you an assignment. So if you're following along at home, here's a piece of functionality that we don't currently have that would be really great to add, and that you have everything you need so far in your learning about React from these videos. You have everything you need to be able to implement this functionality. Functionality is adding an up and a down button to each card, and when you click the up button, it moves the card up in the column, and when you click the down button, it moves it down, so it kind of slides it along, replacing, switching place with the one beneath it when you press down, switching place with the one above it when you press up, so that you can order the cards, which is obviously a useful piece of functionality for a Kanban board. Okay, that is an introduction to state in React. Hope that's been helpful. Hit me up on GitHub issues or on the YouTube comments if you have any questions, if you get stuck, anything like that. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon with a piece about forms.